Alright, so the EVGA X58 Classified is finally here. So the X58 Classified is the last, but certainly not the least X58 motherboard model that I'm adding to my collection. So the very reason I wanted to get this board in the first place, which I already mentioned in a few of my videos some time ago, is that I still want to give another chance at the single-threaded tests with my very good 980X. So I got an advice or tip from a very respected guy in the overclocking community who goes by the name Smoke from Russia. He told me that I should try this 980X on the EVGA X58 Classified because apparently this board should be able to push those Gulftown CPUs to full pot temperatures with all of the three memory channels running. So if you watched my two other videos with the 980X on the Rampage 3 Black Edition as well as on the Gigabyte X58 OC, there's a very common problem with the Gulftown CPUs that they usually stop somewhere before the actual cold pack temperature when you are running all the three memory channels. So with my 980X, with both of those boards, I always hang at around -160 if I had all of the three memory channels running. And if I just removed the last memory channel or the memory stick from the channel C, I was able to go to full pot temperature quite barely, but anyways with correct voltages. So I'm very excited to test the 980X one more time with this board over here, and this is the kind of like the last chance on challenging high cookie in those single-threaded tests like SuperPi 32M, 1M, PiFast, and so on. So that's why I wanted to get this board in the first place. So the EVGA X58 Classified originally came in 5 different versions ultimately. So the original layout, which this one is, actually came out in 3 different versions. So the very earliest version of the X58 Classified was the X58 Classified 3-way SLI Limited Edition. The exact model number is the E759, and this came out I think very early 2009, at the very early days of the whole X58 platform. And the thing about the E759 is that it has exactly the same layout as this board over here, but it has the NF200 chip on the motherboard next to the ICH10R Southbridge chipset, and that allows more PCI Express lanes for the motherboard. So with that you can run 3 full-length PCI Express X16 slots. So you could run, for example, 3-way SLI with GDX285s back in the day, and even with all those 3 cards installed, you could still run, let's say, a sound card here at the PCI Express 1X slot, some kind of a networking card on the PCI slot, or something similar to that, or even like a separate graphics card for processing the physics. But luckily the separate physics cards have kind of disappeared like long ago already, so that is not something popular anymore compared to what it used to be back in the day. And one option could have been even like quad SLI with 2 GDX 295s. And this version over here, which you can actually determine from the big white sticker down here, so this is the E760, and the only difference between this and the 3-way SLI edition is that this is exactly the same motherboard, but this lacks the NF200 chip on board. And why I wanted to avoid that NF200 chip is that it actually limits overclocking in some way. So it limits the maximum PCI Express frequency that you can achieve, and therefore it also limits the maximum possible base clock you can achieve. So a board with NF200 chip on board is not really good for 2D overclocking with the like the lowest end Bloomfield CPUs. For example, the i7-920 that requires the highest possible PCI Express to get the highest possible base clock. As if you watched my 920 records video, I was pushing the base clock all the way up to like 270 plus, 275 to even 280. So that is a really high value. You cannot run such high value with the original freeway SLI version of the X58 Classified. So that is why I wanted to get the 760. The third version was the 761. That is exactly the same thing as the 760, so it does not have the NF200 chip on board, but it just has some few extra accessories included with the motherboard. So it has the like the small daughter board you can put on the motherboard, and that gives you some few extra controls on the motherboard. So you have separate power and reset buttons, clear CMOS button, then 3 buttons for separate voltages, so you can adjust those 3 voltages on the fly. But it's not really that necessary in my opinion, but it is just something quite fancy. So the overall changes are very minimal between the 3 versions. Then the fourth version was the E762, which is the X58 Classified 4-way SLI edition, and that came out like very late 2009, and when it was almost 2010. That board is really only good for 3D, as the name suggests. So it has 2 NF200 chips on board, and the board is very, very long, like in this way. So I'm not fully sure what's the actual name of the ADX form factor for that very long version, but it has it has tons of PCI Express X16 slots, and with that you can actually run 4-way SLI with GTX 480s, 285s, GTX 580s, etc. And that is not really good for the Bloomfield 2D overclocking either, because of the NF200 chips. So nowadays the only real relevance of these motherboards for overclocking purposes is just 2D. If you want to get the if you want to aim to break the hardware records with very popular hardware like CPUs of the day, we don't really run 3D anymore with these old platforms, so we don't need those very advertised 3D features of those motherboards. So we want the best possible 2D overclocking capabilities from these motherboards. I think the 4-way SLI is decent and very good for maxing out the CPU if you are just running a Gulftown CPU like the 980X, but I just want to have the best possible board all around, so the 4-way SLI is not the optimal one for my use. Then the fifth one is the EVGA X58 Classified 3. So that is the E770. So that is like a fine-tuned version of the original X58 Classified. It doesn't have an NF200 chip on board. It has some few extra connectivity features, and it also has some tweaks at the power delivery area. So that one came out like quite late 2010. It has onboard SATA 3 or SATA 6 gigabits per second ports, onboard USB 3, and I will see if I can provide some good pictures, but the capacitor area between the CPU and the VRAM is a bit different on the 770. So all the other versions have these big, 4 of these big solid gaps between the CPU and the VRAM, and it has like a big row of aluminum polymers instead of these big solid caps. So in theory it could be a tiny bit better overall. So I was originally looking for that specific board, but I really found a good deal on this 760, so I wanted to give it a try. So I found this board included with a Core i7-970. That is a 6-core Gulftown CPU, a locked one, and 6 memory sticks of very bulk DDR3. I found a deal of all of all of those components combined for only 80 euros plus shipping from a local market. So that is extremely good value of finding. The boards alone usually are asked, for example, 150 euros and beyond that on sites like eBay. So the E770 could be the best one overall because of all the tweaks and so on, but there could be some small risk involved. So the real mastermind behind the X58 Classified models, including the and even the P55 boards, was the legendary overclocker called Shamino, who originally worked for Foxconn, and he was the guy behind the, for example, the famous Foxconn Black Ops motherboard for the X58 chipset. I'm not fully sure if he had anything to do with the Foxconn Blood Rage motherboard for the X58 platform, which I already showed you previously, as he jumped from Foxconn to EVGA in 2008, and he stayed there all the way up to like quite late 2010, and then he left EVGA and he went to Asus, and he has been working at Asus since then. And he's like the guy behind all the Apex motherboards, or one of the main guys behind all of those amazing overclocking motherboards. And the sad thing about that thing or event is that the quality of EVGA motherboards after Shamino left EVGA went down dramatically. So like all the EVGA mainstream Sandy Bridge motherboards were really bad. I mean really horrible, sadly. The first kind of somewhat okay EVGA motherboard that was not designed by Shamino was probably the X59 Classified, but luckily now we have the same level of quality that EVGA used to have when we have the X299 Dark, the Z390 Dark, and the upcoming 28-core Xeon X399 SR3 Dark. So that's kind of like the background story of EVGA motherboards of this decade. So the small risk that could involve with the E770 is that it came out just after Shamino left EVGA, so it could have some serious bugs in terms of overclocking. So I will try to get that board still if I find a good deal on it, but I will see what happens with the E760. They should be very close to each other anyway, so there shouldn't be much difference at all between the two. So I will see what happens. So I think we could go through the motherboard, check all the features and how the motherboard looks like, and after we have gone through all the features, then I could talk briefly about my short experience with the motherboard so far on air and water, and then I will just wrap it up and tell you what will be coming in the coming weeks with this board. So the X58 Classified, the original one, is an E80X form factor, so it is a little bit wider than your standard 80X. It has 4 full-length PCI Express X16 slots. Of course, this one does not have the NF200, so you cannot run that many PCI Express devices like the E759, but the X58 chipset natively has 32 PCI Express lanes. So every X58 motherboard should actually do three-way SLI somehow. So if I'm not completely mistaken, on this board you should be able to run like single card over here at X16, then 2 cards on over here with X16 plus X16, and three-way by X16, X8, X8. So you should be able to still run three-way SLI, but of course you could not add so many things on the board in addition to those 3 cards, like PCI Express sound card or similar. But I'm not 100% sure about this. When looking at the board, here at the bottom left corner is your very annoying speaker for your post-process. Many don't like these at all. These are kind of common only on EVGA motherboards. If you were like really clever enough, you could even desolder this loudspeaker if you didn't want to hear it when you post your rig or when you start your rig. Then when just looking at the bottom side of the board, here's your reset and power buttons. A CMOS clear button is over here. There are actually two CMOS clear buttons on the motherboard, so the other one is located right next to the power button, and the another one is at the rear I/O. I'm not that big fan of this CMOS clear button over here, because you could accidentally press this one when you are trying to aim for the power button. And there's a small minus about these buttons is that if you had, let's say, two cards, both on LM2 back in the day, these buttons would be kind of out of reach. So if you had a second card over here with a big, like a fat GPU pot, these buttons would be blocked by that GPU pot, so you could not really reach these buttons. So in that regard, the location of these buttons is not that optimal, but anyways, they are there for you to use them. Then next to those buttons we have two system fan 3-pin connectors over here. Then next to that, I think this is a Firewire port for your case. It's labeled 1394, which should stand for Firewire. And from two USB 2.0 ports for your case. There's only one BIOS chip on this motherboard, so there's one removable BIOS chip over here. So if you happened to break it, you would have to change the BIOS chip altogether. So that is quite a sad aspect of this motherboard, because adding, if the board has at least two BIOS chips, that adds quite a lot of noob-friendly or idiot-friendly aspect to the motherboard. So you can always save the day by flashing the corrupted BIOS from the secondary BIOS. So that is a small minus about this motherboard. Then your CMOS battery is over here. Luckily they added an onboard debug LED on the motherboard. So back in the day, these still weren't that common in high-end overclocking motherboards like this. So for example, the Rampage 2 Extreme nor the Rampage 3 Extreme had an onboard debug LED. So with those boards you would have to add like a separate PCI debug card for your post-process if you wanted to see the codes. There was a debug LED with the Rampage 3 Black Edition, so that was the last one from the ROG line for the X58 motherboard, I mean for the X58 platform, and that one had a debug LED. But just saying. Then the rest of your front panel or the case connectors are over here, like hard drive activity LED, power reset buttons and similar. Then when looking at the storage part of the motherboard, you can notice that there are 8 SATA ports over here, and 6 of which are color-coded black and 2 are color-coded red. So all of the SATA ports over here are actually just SATA 2 ports. So you could assume wrong from the get-go that these two would be SATA 6 ports. I mean SATA 3 ports or SATA 6 gigabits per second ports. But the black ones are just wired directly to the Intel ICH10R Southbridge chipset, and the red ones, so the 2 over here, and there's actually one additional SATA port over here between the first PCI Express X16 slot and the PCI Express X1 slot. This is kind of bad spot for a SATA port. I'm not fully sure why they wanted to add it, but I add it over here, but it is still there if you want to use it. The red ones are wired to a third-party J-Micron storage controller. So they are just SATA 2 ports, but they are third-party ones. So these are the ones you want to use for your extreme overclocking situations if you are trying to push, for example, Core i7-920 to the highest possible level. With these ports you can reach much higher PCI Express frequency compared to the Intel ones. So just plug your SSD or your hard drive to these ones when you are really going to push your Bloomfield to the absolute max. I always use the third-party ones, no matter what CPU I use. Then here is a full-length native IDE port. Not fully sure if you had any use for that, but you could use some very old hard drive on the IDE port for Windows XP tests. So the option is there if you want to use it. Then here's the Southbridge heatsink assembly. It is actually connected to the Northbridge heatsink part. I will take a look at heatsinks in a sec. Then here, next to the DRAM slots, there's actually a small jumper over here, and it has Xcool labeled next to it on the board, and this should be some kind of an LM2 mode jumper. So it's only for extreme cooling situations, so for air or water you should leave this disabled. Another fan connector over here. Then here are all of your PCI Express disabled jumpers, so 4 of them, and they are just for the big red full-length PCI Express X16 slots. So these are just for fault finding. So if you had, let's say, two or three cards installed with water blocks in the same water loop, you could troubleshoot that which of the cards is giving you issues if you don't manage to post your rig anymore, or if some of the cards is giving you artifacts or similar. You could just disable the slots one by one and see which of the cards is a damaged one. So this is very helpful and very handy thing to have on a motherboard like this. Then here is your 24 pin, and over here next to the 24 pin is a 5-pin connector, and this is your EVGA EVBot header. So if you are not familiar with EVGA EVBot, that was a handheld overclocking device released in 2009, I think. So this came out for the very earliest X58 Classified, P55 boards, and the GTX 285 Classified graphics card. So with this, you just connect the EVBot to a motherboard like the X58 Classified over here with this 5-pin wire over here, and you could just change all the different voltages and settings like base clock with this handheld device without sacrificing any of the actual system resources inside the OS. So it's quite handy thing to have. I have mainly just used this device with the EVGA ePower card that you can use to mod any graphics card for better power delivery. Apparently you should not be able to change the actual CPU multiplier on this platform with this EVBot device, so that is a bit sad thing. So you can only change the voltages and the base clock. So it is an okay thing to have. This device is now it's now discontinued, so you can't really find one, and if you happen to see one on eBay or similar, they usually cost a lot of money. So it is not something easy for you to obtain, but you could control one motherboard plus 3 graphics cards at the same time with this device. This was very cool when it came out back in the day, around 10 years ago, but sadly it has been discontinued for a long period of time already. The EVBot connector on the 3 earliest versions of the X58 Classified, it's located in a kind of bad spot in my opinion, so next to the 24 pin over here. It was moved to the I/O panel part of the motherboard with the 4-way SLI version, and the connector is at the rear I/O as well on the E770 of the X58 Classified 3 motherboard model. So that place would be a better location for the EVBot connector in my opinion, but it's still good that it exists and it's just located over here. Then here are all the DDR3 memory slots, so 6 of them in total, so 2 slots per channel. If it was produced today, or with all the knowledge of today, they maybe could have just put a single slot per channel design, but as we have seen, when it comes to DDR3, it doesn't really matter much at all. The difference compared to 2 slots per design, 2 slots per channel design is almost, it's almost next to zero compared to what we have now today with the DDR4, Samsung B-die, sticks and so on. So the motherboard didn't actually come out like without any damage. So apparently the motherboard has suffered a little bit at the postage. So this corner over here has been crushed a bit, so it has bent down. But this actually doesn't affect the functionality at all, which is a good thing for me. So it works 100% so far. But yeah, this has had some really clear damage at the postage. At the postage, it seems. So I got some pictures from the original seller, and there it looks all right. Then other thing that was wrong with this board when I got it this week was that 4 pins at the CPU socket were bent to the side, and the only reason that how could something like that happen must be that the CPU cooler has been mounted too tight against the CPU. So I will provide some pictures for showing the actual damage at the CPU socket. So you can clearly see that there are 4 pins in the CPU socket that are not aligned properly. But I actually managed to realign those pins with very fine headed or fine tip, with very fine tweezers, and it seemed to go all right in the end. So they when looking through 10x magnification loupe, they look all right. But and so far it works really nicely on water, but there's no like 100% guarantee that will it be free of any like issues when I go on LN2 and push the CPU to full pot temperatures. There some signals could be lost, so there could be some weird hangs, but I just have to test that myself. I will keep the board so far because of the good deal, but yeah, that is some a little bit annoying to get when you get a used board like this. And of course I got the board as bulk, so I didn't get the original packaging or any of the accessories that were originally released with the motherboard. So I will see what happens with the board when I just get on testing it on LN2. I'm not fully sure how many phases there are for the memory. I think it's a three phase design for the memory. You can actually see 5 inductors in total, so 4 over here, and this one here is actually a mystery one. So this is the only motherboard model that has an inductor on this side of the MOSFETs, so between the DDR, on this side of the memory slots, so between the memory slots and the CPU. This was actually pointed out originally by Buildzoid when he looked at the motherboard design. So I'm not fully sure what this has to do on the motherboard. Maybe it is there to just clear some excess noise for the memory, I don't know, but it is just there. I'm not fully sure what is the actual use of this inductor over here. Then if you look carefully this side of the board, you can see that there are voltage read points for your digital multimeter. So here's for example VCore, dim voltage, VTT, IOH, which is your North Bridge, CPU PLL, and so on. So I actually tested the load line calibration of this motherboard and it's really spot on. So with load line calibration enabled, if I had, let's say, VCore set at 1.3 volts in the BIOS, the voltage would read 1.305 under load and 1.295 at idle. So the change between the, the difference to the set value was only plus and minus 5 millivolts. So that is absolutely insane result, or really nice result. The VTT is one important voltage on the X58 platform, and that is really nice as well. However, it reads too high value in the BIOS, so it reads 50 to 60 millivolts too high in the BIOS. So if BIOS read, let's say 1.41 volts, the multimeter would read 1.35 to 1.36 and the Elite software in the OS would actually read the same as the multimeter. So I'm not sure why the BIOS is reading a different value compared to the others, but yeah. So it's at least good that they have some kind of accurate voltage measuring options. This is a little bit hard spot to reach when you have the motherboard set up, so a better place would be somewhere over here. But it's at least good that it exists. Now, when looking at the other parts of the VRM, so there's a 10-phase Volterra PWM or VRM design for the CPU. So it should be just a doubled 5-phase VRM for the CPU, but it's really good, and it has it can run higher switching frequency than any other motherboard in the X58 lineup. So you can vary the PWM switching frequency for the V-Core from 800 kHz all the way up to 1333 kHz. And for example, the Rampage 3 Extreme and Black Edition, they can only go up to 1050 kHz from 300, and the X58 AOC from Gigabyte, that can go from 700 to all the way up to 1 MHz or 1000 kHz with the dip switches on the motherboard. So the VRM is definitely amazing on this motherboard. There is a fancy demonstration by Shamino on his very old YouTube channel. I will link it down in the description below. In that demo video, he had two of these motherboards next to each other, and he used the VRM of the other motherboard to power both of the motherboards. So ultimately, he had two quad-core Core i7s running from a single PWM, and he was able to run the both CPUs in a 3D Mark 06 CPU test over and over again with just one VRM solution powering both of the CPUs. That really shows how overkill design the VRM is on this motherboard model. And the VRM of that board in that demo was just on air, air cooled, so not even on water. So that is really nice result. So the VRM solution should be very good even for 6.6 GHz plus in W prime and other multi-threaded tests with the Gulftown CPUs like the 980X. So I will see how this will compare in W prime. Two 8-pin power connectors for the CPU power, so that is very nice. So even on paper it can provide up to 600 watts, but of course it can go even past that. And the Gulftown CPUs can really draw a lot of power when you push them above 6.5 or 6.6 in multi-threaded tests, and you can really you can easily split the load inside your power supply when you have two full 8-pin connectors like this. So that is something really nice. The heat sinks are really nice on this motherboard. So this huge heat sink over here, that is just for your North Bridge or the X58 North Bridge, and it is still also connected to the South Bridge part of the heatsink as well. There's a three-phase VRM design. I'm not fully sure if this is for the VTT or for the actual North Bridge itself, but the overall VRM part of this motherboard is really nice, and the heatsinks are really nice performance-wise. So they are not just some big chunks of metal or plastic that are not really good for heat dissipation. So these have really nice stacked fin designs. And the North Bridge part of the heatsink, this has an EVGA logo over here that actually lights up, and it creates that kind of pulsating effect. So it looks really nice for a motherboard of this age, and it looks better in my eye compared to the like modern RGB colors of today's motherboards. So it looks kind of cool when it's set up in your case. Here, still when looking at the socket area, there's your 4-pin CPU fan header over here, and then there's another jumper over here, and it has a label text called CSC strap I limit labeled at the jumper, and when I just googled around that what this does is that it should, when you enable this, it should disable your CPU turbo mode permanently. So I'm not fully sure where you would want to use that, but you can do that apparently with this jumper. Well, however, for CPUs like the 980X, you should not enable this because you need the turbo mode in order to be able to change the CPU multiplier on the fly in the OS. So another good aspect of the X58 Classified boards is that you have CPU multiplier control inside your OS. For example, the Asus motherboards like the Rampage 3 Black Edition and Extreme, you can only change the base clock inside the OS, and that is really not good in my opinion. You cannot really go for the highest possible CPU-Z validation, for example, if you don't have multiplier control. So you can change the CPU multiplier when you have turbo mode enabled with the included Elite tuning software. So that is very good to have. So both the Gigabyte X58 AOC has the multiplier control with the buttons as well as the EasyTune 6 software, and so does this with the Elite. So that is a big minus for Asus and a big plus or thumbs up for EVGA and Gigabyte in this regard. It makes overclocking much easier when you can just boot the system at, let's say, 6 GHz on LN2, and you can use the software to change the multiplier so that you can get 7.2 in the OS, and then you just press F7 on CPU-Z to save the validation file. That is much easier than messing around with base clock. You cannot change the base clock endlessly inside the OS because it affects the memory, QPI and everything. So you have some kind of like limit on how much you can actually change that inside the OS. So that's one part of the board. So let's move on to the rear I/O. So when just looking at the rear I/O of the motherboard, here's your native PS2 port for your keyboard. Very good to have. PS2 is amazing in Windows XP environment and other old operating systems. 2 USB 2s underneath that. Another clear CMOS button, which I already mentioned at the start of this video. Then your SPDIF optical audio port, your coaxial audio port over here. 2 more USB 2.0 ports, Firewire port plus eSATA, dual LAN, and then 4 more USB 2.0 ports and your 7.1 audio. So that's pretty much it, how the motherboard looks like. Nothing anything important on the back. So yeah, so that's pretty much it, how the X58 Classified is layout, or what kind of layout the X58 Classified has. So my first experiences with the motherboard when I tested with my golden 980X and with very highly binned LPDA hyper-based memories was actually quite good. So when I maxed out the VRM settings, so I put 1333 kilohertz for the vCore VRM and 690 kilohertz for the VTT VRM, I was able to run W prime at 4.8 gigahertz at around 1.4 volts or slightly above 1.4 volts measured. So that is a really nice result, and it's on par with the Rampage 3 Black Edition as well as the Gigabyte X58 AOC. So CPU part definitely looks good. Then I also tested the memory overclocking part of the motherboard, now on with the CPU just on air, and I was actually able to run 2100 and above with 675 timings with these LPDA hyper-based memories. And the difference compared to Rampage 3 boards and X58 AOC was that I was actually able to run correct performance with 675 timings with this motherboard. So if you watched my 920 scores video, there I mentioned that I had really bad performance with 675 timings, and the best combination, at least on Rampage 3 Black Edition, was always 686 timings, and that is why I used that. That is why I used that memory configuration with the Rampage 3 Black Edition always. So with the X58 Classified, I clearly had better performance with 675 timings compared to 676 or 686. So that is a really nice aspect already on the X58 Classified. So it looks really nice. So that is pretty much it. The only bad thing what I don't like the X58 Classified is the way you update the BIOS. So there's no utility inside the BIOS to update the BIOS itself. So if you want to change the BIOS on this motherboard model, you have to download the BIOS file from EVGA website, and it actually comes in as an ISO file. Normally BIOS files are .bin files, and you have to burn that to a DVD or to a USB stick, and then you have to boot that device, the DVD or the USB stick, and then you just update the BIOS in a DOS environment. So it's pretty much the same way as you would flash the BIOS of your graphics card in the the old school way, like the ATI flash, which was usually done in a DOS environment before the the Windows Flash versions came out later. So that is quite an annoying thing. I don't like that way of flashing the BIOS, and of course then the other aspect is that there's only one BIOS chip. So it is actually quite easy to brick the BIOS on this motherboard model. So you have to be very careful when you update the BIOS on this motherboard. And it could also be that this motherboard works the best with unlocked CPUs. So for example the 980X or the 990X and the unlocked quad-core Bloomfields like the Core i7 Extreme 975 and the 965, because you cannot change the multiplier at all if you are running a locked CPU like 920, 930, 940, 950 or the 970. So I'm not fully sure how well this compares to the Rampage 3 boards and the X58 AOC when you are running a locked CPU like the 920. So it could be so that this isn't the best motherboard for those locked CPUs. So this could be the ultimate king for the unlocked CPUs, like for example the models I just mentioned. So we have to see what happens. I will be testing the 980X again on LM2 probably very early January when I get back from my trip. So when I have better spot to do that. So have to wait until then. I really like this board. I like the overall design and layout. It was definitely easy to handle. The BIOS is very easy to navigate. So it's very easy to overclock on this motherboard, and it's also good that the voltage values are so spot on. So there's not a clear difference to the set values. For example, how much the Gigabyte X58 AOC actually overshoots the VTT voltage, and even the Asus overshoots some of the voltages as well. And also since that my 980X requires really high CPU PLL voltage to hit full plot temperatures, I actually checked what is the maximum value you can set for the CPU PLL inside the BIOS, and the maximum value is 2.7 volts. So it is highest among all of the X58 boards. So this definitely has enough range for even the most weird Gulftown CPUs out there. So that is good. So there's no need to modify the motherboard for higher PLL value. You would have to do that on the Rampage 3 boards, because the maximum you can set on those is only 2.1 or something like that. So yeah, so that is pretty much that's pretty much it. So that's how the X58 Classified looks like, the overall background story about it, and my first experiences with the board. So this is the fifth high-end X58 motherboard model that I've had over here. So I've had the Rampage 3 Black Edition as well as the Rampage 3 Extreme. The Extreme I actually sent back to the original owner as I didn't have that much use for it, as it's pretty much the same thing as the Black Edition. And then I also had the Gigabyte X58 AOC, which I used for the W Prime and CPU-Z top scores with the 980X. Then also the Foxconn Blood Rage, which I still need to test with the 920. And now the fifth one is this. I will still try to get the E770 if I find a good deal on it, as I already said. But yeah, so now I'm just looking forward to forward on seeing what happens with the 980X with this board over here. So if things go well, this could be the final solution on fixing the weird issues with the Gulftown CPUs, because it doesn't sound realistic at all that there is some batch of 980X CPUs that could run multi-threaded tests like W Prime, Cinebench, and so on at a higher clock speed than single-threaded tests like SuperPi 32M, 1M, PiFast, and so on. To be able to challenge HiCookie in those single-threaded tests, you have to be able to run all 3 memory channels for the best efficiency. So if you have to sacrifice the third channel, you will never have good enough efficiency for the top scores. So just saying. So that's why this is kind of like the last chance with the 980X that I have. If it doesn't change at all, so if this cannot run full pot, then the 980X just cannot challenge HiCookie in those tests, but we will see about that. But yeah, so that's pretty much it. If you had any of these X58 Classified boards from EVGA back in the day, if you have any personal experience about these boards, and if you have any questions about this board based on my video, then please drop all of those comments down below. And if you like this video, then please give a thumbs up and maybe share this video, and subscribe to my channel. And then I guess it's just thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.